So my trajectory to become a dietitian was actually an accidental one, because all through secondary school, all I wanted to do was be a physiotherapist, and that's because I spent half my life as a teenager in the physiotherapist office with repetitive injuries from gymnastics, of all things.
All right. Yep.
So I think my parents were probably happy with this career trajectory, because maybe they could recoup some of the funds they had spent over many years of me being at the physio. You know, it's interesting. I changed path, really, and then did science, and then you know, into the masters of dietetics. But sport was always I was always very interested and passionate about sport. I didn't necessarily have on my radar that I would be, you know, a sports dietitian and be working with this person, or these organisations. But actually, as luck would have it more than anything else, some connections that I made and some meetings I went to in the early days of SDA, you know, when Karen Inge was very much at the helm, you know, I made some really good friends and some networks, and I found myself in very fortunate positions actually, where I had opportunities to work with organisations like the Australian Ballet School and in the AFL, where I worked for about 5 years as well. So yeah, it's kind of led on from there. Yes. So, you know, I've been a combination eating disorder specialist and a sports specialist.
Yeah.
And of course, well, not of course, I shouldn't say of course, but, you know, one might guess that the kind of the intersecting nature of those two working spaces is quite significant. That is not to say by any stretch that all athletes have eating disorders, or all people with eating disorders have an issue with exercise, because we know that's not the case. But that, you know, when I had begun working, especially with high performance athletes, that I found that I was able to pick up on some of the early warning signs, or some of the maybe the signals of disordered eating patterns, or you know, some dysregulation that they were demonstrating, or difficulties with mood or in their relationships with food, that I think under other circumstances I don't think I would have picked that up. And so my work in eating disorders, you know, dovetailed really nicely with my work, for example, in footy, with cricket, or with ballet, where, you know, those skills I was able to kind of pick up some early warning signs in athletes. And I think that's where just that intersection really fit very naturally for me. Yeah, definitely. Look, I think I probably see more than other sports dietitians do, and I probably see more athletes than the average eating disorders dietitian does, and that's probably just because I've been around for a while. Yeah, I think that the intersection is much more significant than we have believed. Certainly, you know, statistically, it really varies from sport to sport and across different age groups and genders, ethnicities. It really does vary. And then, of course, you know, there's the specific kind of diagnostic categories. But I always look at the statistics and think, oh, I think it's much higher than that, actually. And I think one of the reasons why I think it is much higher is not only because I think I pick up things that maybe other people don't, for no other reason than I'm just more familiar with what it sounds like, or what it's not even, as we know, eating disorders don't have a look, but they can sometimes have a sound. It sounds like anxiety around food. It sounds like hesitation, or it sounds like overthinking. And so when we understand sometimes the thinking patterns, or the way people might interact with food, or the way people might express feeling about their body, I think I just kind of, I pick up on these things. But yeah, hopefully as awareness increases, and I know that, you know, the work that NEDC has done with the Australian Institute of Sport has been incredibly formative, with hopefully organisations being able to be more aware of eating disorders, and with awareness comes then also taking all mental health, not just eating disorders, but all mental health more seriously, and being able to support athletes in a stigma-free way. So yeah, it's a really important it's a really important collaboration, actually. Yeah. Look, I think that when we're having more overt conversations about mental health in general, I think it does make it easier to then talk about the specific ways that mental health can turn up in individual athletes and also in organisations as well, and also support staff and everybody. So I think when a lot of people think about mental health, they really do think mainly about depression and anxiety because, of course, organisations like Beyond Blue have done a spectacular job at raising the profile and reducing stigma of these very common mental health conditions and experiences. But I think what a lot of organisations and individuals forget is that, you know, eating disorders are part of a mental health concern. They are part of a set of mental health experiences which manifest in food, eating, body image concerns. And sometimes, not sometimes, often what happens is that in the sports setting, it's often masked because it varies from sport to sport and organisation to organisation, but sometimes disordered eating can actually look like somebody who's very committed and very, very dedicated as an athlete, or somebody who is very perfectionistic. Whereas when we're looking through the eating disorder or mental health lens, we actually might be seeing that, oh goodness, that's not necessarily leading them to enhanced performance, for example, or it might be impacting their mood and their mental health in lots of ways. But actually on the surface of it, this person just looks like a really committed, dedicated athlete, and maybe not too much different from other people. And so I think when we're looking at what are we actually becoming aware of, I think one of the things that it can be tricky and it can actually be uncomfortable when you're having these conversations with organisations because you're kind of pulling the veil back a little bit on what is very, very normalised within a lot of organisations. And sometimes it can be really tricky to get your head around as well, particularly if coaches and directors have been athletes themselves. And, you know, maybe they don't see these symptoms as part of a disordered eating spectrum, for example, but rather they see it as, oh, that's just part of being an athlete. So I think that's the major source of awareness, is kind of disentangling this, you know, what does it mean to be a committed athlete and dedicated athlete? And then what does it mean for, you know, our thinking and our feeling and the way we're expressing or coping, for example, using food, eating and body-related strategies that can be really disruptive to our health and well-being, let alone our performance, which is often at the forefront of an athlete's kind of priority list. So I think, in my experience, what has often happened, and it's not the best way that this unfolds, unfortunately, but this has been my observation over years, is that an athlete becomes really quite unwell with an eating disorder, and all of a sudden the organisation is like, whoop, you know, they really deeply care for their athletes, and they want the athlete to get help. But what they often don't realise, through no fault of their own often, is that for every one athlete that gets actually very, very unwell with an eating disorder, there's going to be a whole bunch of them that are just kind of skating around, engaging probably in quite high level disordered eating behaviours, but that haven't been picked up on because maybe their behaviours haven't led to, for example, medical instability or a significant reduction in performance or dramatic weight loss or weight fluctuations or any of those more overt kind of signals that we might pick up on. But in my experience, what has happened is that, you know, an athlete becomes really quite unwell. All of a sudden, the team or the organisation, their attention is drawn straight to this particular issue. And much as I don't want this to be the vehicle in, I personally have found it to be that people are much more open when they see that, oh my goodness, this has happened to somebody who I know, somebody who perhaps I didn't even pick it, perhaps it went on for so long and I didn't see it, you know. And do I wish it happened in that way? No, actually I don't at all. It's not what we want. We don't want people to get so sick that's when it, you know, draws attention to it. I don't think that's the way we need to go. I do think we need to stay on the front foot and to help organisations take this seriously before people get unwell, because, yeah, as I said, for every person that gets really quite unwell, it's like an iceberg. You know, the person that's kind of showing the symptoms is just going to be the tip of the iceberg. So absolutely critical. Prevention and early intervention are absolutely crucial parts of being able to tackle eating disorders in general. I think that when we leave it to the kind of treatment phase or the intervention phase, that it's not that it's too late, because I do believe that recovery is possible for a vast majority of people. And also one of the issues, of course, with prevention and early intervention, well, prevention in particular, is that it can't necessarily be counted, because we don't know what hasn't happened. And so I think when it comes to things like funding and investment, even financial investment or emotional or time and energy investment, I think organisations are, you know, a little bit on the back foot rather than the front foot, because prevention isn't necessarily able to be counted in the same way as intervention is. So I think that's one of the tricky things of prevention. Early intervention, I believe, kind of can be counted a little bit more accurately, you know, especially quantitatively. But what actually happens, and I say this from firsthand experience, is that the more you intervene, the more that you implement, I should say, prevention and early intervention in organisations, what happens is that with increased awareness comes increased, you'll pick up things that have always been there, but all of a sudden you start picking them up, and it can lead to this very unhelpful narrative of, oh, if we talk about it, it makes it worse. It doesn't make it worse, but what happens is you see things that have always been there, but that haven't been picked up on. So if you're implementing, for example, screening tools, if you're implementing pathways of care, or you're implementing, for example, flags, you know, so if flags are showing up and you're reporting to a central person, for example, which is part of an early intervention framework, then it does look like things are getting worse. They're not actually getting worse. The prevention and early intervention model is doing what it's meant to do. It's picking up people in those early stages and then being able to offer them care at the stage they're at, rather than, oh my goodness, you know, deep into diagnostic territory and deep into treatment territory, which is really not where we want to be at all before we're, you know, supporting an athlete. So in terms of risk reduction, well, what we know is that so the research shows us that actually sports participation more broadly is actually protective, which is fantastic, you know. But what we do know is that there are several kind of categories of sport that actually confer higher risk. So things like our aesthetic sports, so things like gymnastics, diving, ballet, dancing, synchronized swimming, diving. I already said diving, but twice, for no other reason. So aesthetic sports is one which confers a higher risk. And then another group of sports is what's called weight category sports. So often these are people like jockeys, people doing martial arts or boxing, lightweight rowing, those kind of sports which actually are divided into weight categories. So reducing risk, I don't think, is about doing away with those sports, but what it is about understanding that within these sports, there is a higher risk for very specific reasons, and how can we address these specific risk factors within these sports without tarring every single sport with the same brush? Because anybody who's been involved in sport knows that for most people, that it is a fantastic way to engage socially, to move your body in ways that feel good, to have that camaraderie, to feel strong and energetic and community oriented, no matter what level you're participating at. So there's so much good about sport, but we also just need to be aware that, you know, and I know that this is something I talk about all the time, is that, you know, it can happen any sport, any age, any gender, any stage of development. Like, risk is really across the board, but kind of it does narrow in on certain certain sports for kind of specific reasons, because there is an enhanced focus on the body or on the body composition and or on weight, so in numbers, which can be quite problematic for people. So again, it's not like we're doing away with these sports, but we just need to be aware of increased risk. The second thing I would talk about is that there are times of increased risk. So during adolescence, we know there's increased risk. During transitions, any kind of transitions, there's an increased risk. So whether that's transition between teams or up a level, down a level, injury, moving away from home, you know, becoming more independent, having to move back home, COVID, loss through injury, loss through not being in a team anymore, loss through retirement, or stepping away from a sport. So there's lots of specific risk factors then if we were to kind of move down the ladder there. So it's I think being aware of risk. I think there's that saying that says alert but not alarmed, something like that. We don't want to alarm people and say, if you don't do this, you're going to have a team full of people with eating disorders, because not only is that untrue, it's also really unhelpful, and we don't respond well when we're coming from that alarmed, activated place. What we do is we as humans respond really well when we're well educated, well informed, and that we can respond from a very calm and considered and aware space. So that's what we're all trying to do together. Well, of course, I'm going to be very biased as a dietitian myself, of course, but I believe that dietitians have an absolutely integral role to play in prevention, early intervention, and in the intervention and treatment phases as well. So it's not just about writing a meal plan or education about nutrition, although that can be part of it for some people. It's about so much more than that. Often the dietitian has, especially in big organisations with higher level athletes, already has an existing relationship with the athletes. And as we know, people with existing relationships, when we can build on trust and rapport that's already there, the role of the dietitian is absolutely critical to being able to help and support somebody move away from the disordered eating behaviours and thoughts and difficult feelings associated with food and eating and body image, and then to be able to move towards a more connected, interoceptive, responsive, health and wellbeing focused interactions and relationships with food and eating and their body. So I think that the role of the dietitian has really broadened and expanded over the years. It very much did used to be we wrote meal plans, but you ask any dietitian, and probably the same as me, they're like, oh my goodness, we do so much more than that. So a lot of the struggles that athletes will bring will be around food, and so we can be the people that can really ally their fears and can really support them to become courageous in their eating. In their eating efforts, I guess, to be able to fuel their body from a place of care. And certainly for athletes, what I have personally found really useful is really understanding them as people and athletes as well. So both, and understanding not only what their health and wellbeing kind of goals are, I guess you would say, but also their performance goals too, because what we know is that eating disorder and optimal performance, they do not go together at all. And so understanding, where do you want to be? Like, what are your performance goals? What are your, depending on the sport, right? Where do you want to be? And how can we support individual athletes and then also teams, organisations, and so on up the ladder, to be able to create cultures where athletes and teams are supported to be able to fuel and nourish their bodies properly, rather than using food as a way to manipulate the body, using food as a way to nourish and fuel the body. And so that's in sports land, that's typically how we talk about, fueling and nourishing and building and strengthening, things like that. So those are not necessarily, I would use the word nourishing with my non-athlete athlete clients, but I think with athletes, you know, when you can speak their language a little bit and when you can really meet them where they're at using kind of sport specific examples and making sure you're staying really open-minded, you know, communicating with their support crew, then the trust and rapport is a lot easier. What I would say is that, you know, I mentioned it a little bit before, but I think what happens with a lot of high performance athletes is that they don't necessarily know too much about themselves aside from being an athlete. So a lot of their sense of self has been wrapped up in being, for example, a ballet dancer, or like they would say, I am a dancer. That's how they would describe themselves, as opposed to I am an individual or I am a female, like, or I am a student. They would say I am a dancer, particularly the very high level, because often they're dancing very, very little, very much part of their life. And the culture, particularly in dance, can be a strong one. Like it's a huge gift to work there and to have so much interaction with these really quite brilliant young people in so many ways, so impressive on so many levels. And so I think, you know, what I try to do is hold those two things, like honouring their high level of commitment and dedication, but also to remember they're a human being first, you know. And I think that about all my clients anyway, is see the person first, which I think sometimes, especially when people are really quite unwell, we can find ourselves kind of looking through the lens of a diagnosis, as opposed to that this is a person who's really struggling and is finding life really difficult and is calling upon all their skills, you know, which look quite disordered to us. And, you know, how can we support them to turn towards life, to turn towards healing and connection and all those things that we know are so vital for recovery. So in terms of my work with, for example, at the Australian Ballet School, so much intersects just with my regular work as well. But that I think what these young people have really taught me is a lot about persistence and a lot about the value of building rapport, and the importance of really understanding them and understanding their dedication and their commitment, whilst not being distracted by, you know, by anything that pops up, you know, any kind of issues at hand. So we don't see things through the lens of, oh, that's just ballet. We think a little bit more broadly than that and think, you know, how has our experience in, for example, ballet, impacted the way that I relate to my body, in the way that I relate to food and what my food choices are, or how I allow myself to eat, or how I don't allow myself maybe to eat particular foods. I guess it's like a Venn diagram, I suppose. So much intersects, but there is some separateness there. I mean, 2020 has been one out of the box, hasn't it? And there's going to be so much uncertainty moving forward too. I know we kind of talk about this year being the year, but then I think to myself, you know, when December the 31st clicks over until January the 1st, it's not like, bang, we're done. I imagine we're going to be dealing with certainly echoes, for many years to come. So that includes eating disorders and broader mental health, of course, economic consequences, and all the different ways in which this year has inextricably impacted individuals and groups and communities and so forth. So I think for athletes, no matter what level you're competing at or participating in, you know, from a kind of, you know, recreational and community right up to very high performance, look, I think the difference is that with our high performance athletes, the loss and the grief associated with the loss of opportunities this year is palpable, and it runs really deep. For some, that will have been their last opportunity to give something a go, and for others, they'll just be at the start of their career, and the loss of the, you know, just the start of it will be really deeply felt. I also think that this year and the loss and the grief and the hard things, they have affected people differently. I've come to really understand you know, how we've had this kind of saying, you know, we're all in this together. although I believe that to some degree, I think, you know, we're not all in the same boat. We're in different boats. Some of us are in dinghies with holes in them, and some of us are in very expensive yachts. And I think that's something we really need to take very seriously, is that, sure, this impacts everybody, but it definitely impacts different people in different ways. So even within the same team, for example, let's just say a hockey team that would use Tokyo for the Olympics, you could line up those 25 individuals, and they will all be coping in very, very different ways. And some of them will be coping by turning to or away from food, or turning towards or away from exercise, for example, or, you know, some of them may have had eating disorders in the past, now be recovered, and they're struggling again. And I think that, you know, that my heart breaks for people who feel like they can't reach out again for help, or feel like, oh, I did that, that should be behind me, and be kind of self-deprecating around that. But for people to understand that when life knocks us around, that it makes sense, really, that we might turn back towards something that's really familiar. You know, and for some people that might have been, you know, some disordered eating spectrum behaviours of some description. So again, we're kind of looping back to reducing the stigma, reducing the shame, reducing the silence, and really encouraging people to stay connected to things that matter, and to surround ourselves as much as possible with communities that really understand, you know, what we're going through. So it's yeah, it requires lots of work on lots of different levels, but yeah, I think probably that sums up COVID for us. Absolutely. Look, I think that that research into eating disorders is absolutely essential, because unless we have research, and we don't know what is effective and what isn't, we're kind of just poking around in the dark, which is what, in my early years, for the first half of my career, that's what I was doing. I was poking around in the dark, had no idea what I was doing. People seemed to progress. I didn't really know what to call it or what it was. So I think, you know, understanding what it is that we do that's effective, and understanding what we do that's less effective, you know, or understanding what it is that we do that's just the best we can do under some very imperfect circumstances, at least then we know more. So I think research is incredibly important. And because there can never be enough research, in my opinion, I think most of the time we're taking guesses, and we're just really trying to do the best we can with the individual in front of us. You know, if they do have a team that's using one of our evidence-based models, then that's fantastic. But unfortunately, that's not always the case, and we just have to do the best we can with what we've got. And sometimes that's extremely effective. Sometimes it's less effective. Sometimes we just don't know. And that's one of the it's one of the things that actually I love about eating disorders, is there's not one way to get well, and there's not one way to be an eating disorders dietitian. Because if there was, I would hope that after almost 20 years, I might have come across it by now. But the truth is, there's not. And people can get well in lots of different ways, you know, lots of different community ways, lots of different treatment-oriented ways, and that, you know, really just, you know, supporting people to live their best, whatever that is, you know, would be something that we'd be aiming for.